I'm curious how, I think I know how, but I want you to lay it out, how you have connected this problem, the replication problem, or the sort of epistemological crises, and maybe more in social science, to this question of circumcision. How did you come to this topic? Since most people are deeply averse to talking about this, how did you come to it, and how do you make that connection between those two topics?
Yeah, well, one way probably has to do with the fact that I've spent time in both the US and in Europe, and there are very different attitudes among comparably qualified experts as to the empirical facts surrounding circumcision. So, American doctors, at least in 2012, they came around to this view that the benefits of neonatal circumcision, which is removing the penile foreskin, outweigh the risks, by which they mean the known surgical risks. Meanwhile, European physicians typically have the opposite view. They think, well, this is healthy tissue and a healthy baby, and you would only want to cut off, sensitive genital tissue if you really had to, urgently deal with an issue. And so they would say the risks outweigh the benefits. And this was really curious to me. I thought, well, it seems like either the risks outweigh the benefits or they don't. I mean, you're looking at the same literature here. So why is it that American doctors are saying one thing and European doctors are saying another thing? Well, immediately you get into the realization that there are different cultural practices of circumcision in these different countries. Circumcision is a normalized practice in the United States, and it's not in Europe nor in much of, say, Latin America and China. I mean, basically 2/3 or 3/4 of circumcisions in the world happen in the Muslim world as a religious practice. Then there's a very small proportion that happen in Judaism. There's circumcisions as initiations into adulthood that happen throughout Africa, sometimes overlapping with Islamic tradition and sometimes not. But the United States is the only the so-called developed, industrialized Western country that circumcises a majority of newborn boys for non-religious reasons. Israel also circumcises a majority of newborn boys, but for kind of explicitly religious Jewish reasons. And so this is just a puzzle. It's like, what's going on? I mean, the US prides itself as being the pinnacle of civilization, and yet it's doing something that's mostly done for religious and tribal initiation reasons, but dressed up in this kind of medical veneer. And then you think, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe the medical evidence supports this view. But then you have a whole bunch of doctors in a non-circumcising society saying, yeah, we look at the evidence, we're just not at all convinced. So you start to realize that how we characterize benefits and risks, how we interpret the evidence regarding benefits and risks, what we think is at stake in a given benefit or a given risk, and how we weigh these things in our minds are not just scientific questions. They're questions that are done in the context of background value assumptions. So just as an example, in the United States, most male doctors had their part of their penis removed when they were infants. So they've never had any experience with this part of their body. And I don't want to do psychoanalysis or anything like that, but I'll just say that there's some reason to want to think that this part of your body probably is not very valuable. Otherwise, it'd be quite sad that it had been removed before you could object. So there's at least some reason to want to conclude that this is just some extra tissue or something. I don't know, it was removed. I don't care. It has a value of 0. So if that's true, and then you want to do a benefit risk analysis, you're not going to include the lost tissue in the harm column because it's worth nothing. So then all you are going to say is, well, what's the risk of bleeding? What's the risk of infection? What's the risk of accidentally cutting off too much tissue or something like that? And maybe you'll put that in the harm column, but that's not very carefully studied. There aren't systematic records on this. So there's also an epistemological gap here. And then you can just focus on the benefits. So if you look at the American Academy of Pediatric Policy from 2012, they say basically literally this. Circumcision is the removal of the foreskin, whatever that is. And here are some benefits that follow from that. Now let's say you're a European doctor and you have a foreskin and you realize it's erogenous tissue and you had with it and you enjoy the way it feels during sex and so forth. You would assign a positive value to this tissue and say, gosh, I wouldn't want anyone to remove this from my body unless I had a serious disease or something and it was the only option. So even in Europe, for example, if there is a problem with the foreskin, they'll still try to preserve as much tissue of it as much as possible because they don't want to lose this very sensitive tissue that's enjoyable to play with. I mean, it's erogenous tissue. So now you can start to see how if I'm going to do a benefit risk calculus over in Europe, they say that there's a loss here. And that loss would have to be justified by pretty significant benefits that you couldn't achieve non-surgically. That's the other thing too. Normally you wouldn't perform a surgery on a healthy child. I mean, basically you wouldn't perform a surgery on a healthy child you would perform a surgery on a child who had a problem that could best or only be addressed through surgery. Otherwise, you would try to avoid surgery and always use more conservative measures. So in the United States, they'll often say like, well, we think the risk of urinary tract infections is lower if you're circumcised in infancy than if you're not. It's like, okay, so what's the risk of a urinary tract infection? And it turns out it's like maybe a little over 1% in non-circumcised boys and a little under 1% in circumcised boys. These data are themselves contested because there's like measurement problems as to how you come up with the estimate in the first place. But let's just assume it's true. Mm-hmm. That means you'd have to do like 111 circumcisions to prevent one urinary tract infection, which is treatable in almost all cases by oral antibiotics, where you don't have to remove any tissue at all. Meanwhile, girls get UTIs like 5 to 8 times more frequently than boys do, but you wouldn't even consider preemptively removing tissue from the vulva as a way of hopefully reducing the risk of an infrequent thing that if it happens, you can treat non-surgically. So once you start to actually inquire into the reasons why American doctors think that circumcision is like a health procedure, the arguments fall apart with like only a tiny amount of inquiry. And so you start to, again, get the sense that there's this thing we do in the United States maybe I'll tell some of the history if we have time, but like it became a birth custom in the United States. It's the sort of thing that we just do around here. The doctors themselves had it done to them. And so it just continues by this inertia. And then you don't want to feel like you're doing something crazy. So you have to come up with rational sounding reasons for why you do it. So you say, oh, it has health benefits. It lowers the risk of urinary tract infections. That sounds good. Yeah, I don't want a urinary tract infection. But when you actually think of what the alternatives are to preemptive surgery on a healthy child, there's like pretty good alternatives. Like, most of these kids aren't going to get a urinary tract infection. And the ones who do can have it treated. And surgery doesn't even enter into the equation. So it becomes very clear it's a post hoc justification rather than a legitimate prior reason for undertaking the surgery. So anyway, the things that are involved in this are like, why do different experts in different cultural environments reach different conclusions about seemingly straightforward scientific data analysis and so forth? That's very interesting to me. This has to do with sexuality. It has to do with taboos. I think we don't want to talk about genitals. I mean, here I'm on a podcast talking about penises and foreskins. Who wants to do that? Well, you have to do that if you want to adjudicate the moral questions that are at stake in this. So it gets on taboos, sexuality, gender differences. It gets into do with history and sociology of medicine, how something becomes medicalized, and we start to think of it as a medical thing as opposed to like a tribal right, which is how circumcision originated. And so all these kinds of things swirl around this topic. And so it's very fruitful, actually, if you want to get interested in something where there's no end to the conversation and you're constantly going to be thinking about really difficult questions about how we, think of ourselves as scientists, how we think of ourselves as citizens debating different values. Some people think that circumcision should be done purely for religious reasons. They say, yeah, health benefits. I don't know. I think it should be allowed to because God said it's okay to do. And other people might be like, well, yeah, but if God tells you to cut off part of your child's body, like that's not necessarily a legitimate reason for doing it, and so now you can get into philosophy of religion if you want to do it. So anyway, that's partly why I persist on this topic. Even though it came about for this one reason.
Well, I think it's a really interesting one. I have sort of 3 follow-ups if you're good to go into this a little bit.
Sure, I could talk about this all day and all night and tomorrow and the next day
okay.
and the rest of my life. I mean, I have studied this question quite a lot.
So one of the things that I do find fascinating, I sort of have 3 of them, but I think I'll take each one in turn. The one that's really of interest is sort of this comes about like no American male was circumcised before the Victorian era, like Jews and Muslims, but they were a very small percentage of the population. And they still are in the United States, very small percentage of the population. This basically was a thing that came about in the Victorian era, in the same time that it happens in the UK. But then the UK sort of breaks away from it after the Second World War. And then the United States doesn't. And I find the difference there to be absolutely fascinating, because the justification, unless I'm wrong, is the same in both countries in 1885, but they changed dramatically after the war. Can you speak to a little bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, so part of what happened in England was that there was the introduction of the National Health Service. And if you were going to pay for something on the National Health Service, you had to have adequate evidence that it was a necessary procedure. And so there were some publications around the time that were trying to take a second hard look at the sorts of data that had been generated to support the health benefits of circumcision. And the doctor said, well, listen, this is just not very convincing. And there's a certain amount of risk, and a certain number of babies are going to die every year if you do enough of these things. And so given that you can pursue virtually all of these health benefits in non-surgical ways that also, respect the bodily integrity and future autonomy of the child to decide about their own body, there's no justification that would warrant paying for this out of NHS funds. The US, on the other hand, doesn't have a national health service, and so the same question didn't arise. That's one reason why the pathways split between what happened in England and the United States. That might be the main one. I mean, it's a puzzle. Social scientists and historians of medicine are puzzled as to why the United States persists as the only kind of, modern Western country that performs newborn circumcision as a cultural habit on the majority of newborns. It's a bit of a puzzle, but that's one of the possible reasons.
Well,
I mean, similarly, New Zealand and Australia also did routine circumcision based on the British model. I mean, this was kind of going on in Victorian England, as you say. Partly was advocated as a anti-masturbation measure because masturbation was seen as both a medical problem and a moral problem. And the thought was, if you remove sensitive tissue, that will reduce the risk that the child will touch themselves and create all sorts of problems. By the way, they're doing female circumcisions in England at the same time, meaning that they were removing the clitoral hood, which is analogous to the foreskin, or at least cutting off part of it, or separating adhesions between the clitoral hood and the clitoral glands. And so these things were being done in parallel. The female procedure fell out of favor in the early 1900s, but especially after the 1950s, when people started hearing about female circumcision in the African context, and they could associate it with what they took to be this barbaric thing that brown people did. And so us civilized white people weren't going to be associated with that kind of a practice. And so the medicalized version of female circumcision fell out of favor after the 1950s in the United States and in England and so forth. Male circumcision also fell out of favor in the 1950s in England, and by the 1970s in New Zealand and Australia and all the other kind of Anglo cultures that had followed the British model, and it's just the United States that's persisted. The thing that's funny about that is that the US, of course, has this outsized influence on global policy and, types of studies that get pumped into the medical literature and so forth. And so it has this sort of self-sustaining ability because of its power and prestige and research funding and kind of capture of many of the medical journals. You sort of get this, if you want to find an excuse to do circumcision, you can find some American scientists publish stuff, every other week, arguing that it's the best thing since sliced bread. But, the rest of the kind of Western industrialized world has moved on.
Well, it's a really fascinating one to me. So it's one of those weird dynamics that about America, where it perceives of itself as a classless society, where the Brits very much know that they are not, and it sort of persists that they aren't. But it really gets introduced, and I've picked this up from reading some of your stuff. This is a subject that is sort of has been close to my heart since, oh Lord, middle school.
Sure.
And so it's deep interest, and the idea that that it sort of emerges as an elite practice, because people didn't go to the hospital in 1900. Like, you were born at home.
Yeah, it was a status symbol. It meant that you were able to have access to the latest medical technology. That's how it was being sold at the time. And so it was the upper classes in England,
right,
who had access to this technology.
And then it moves into being a sort of generic routine procedure that, as my mom put it, for my older brothers, the cost for the boy was just $50 more than the girl or whatever. Like, it wasn't even a question in the 70s. You just paid more money. And
it's not only that it wasn't a question in that sense, it's often that it wasn't a question and that the nurses would just assume that you were going to do it. And so maybe they'd have some simulacrum of consent or something like that. But for the most part, it had become so entrenched. It was like clipping the umbilical cord. It's like, well, we're not going to ask for your consent to do that. We'll just go ahead and do it. And so in the US, a lot of parents just never had to face what they were signing off on. They didn't understand what it involved. For example, most parents had no idea that it is a surgery. Like, still today, many people will be like, well, it's just a snip. Like, I don't know what they think is happening. Yeah. It's not that this is just some loose skin that's hanging off. It's adhered to the head of the penis at birth. So you have to separate these structures with a blunt probe, and then you have to apply a clamp. I mean, it's a whole thing. And that introduces risk at every step of this surgery. And if parents thought that I'm having my son go through a genital surgery who's healthy, who has no problems affecting this part of his body, I'm not sure I want to do that. And then if they have to pay for it, then they really are like, oh, it's $1,000, maybe not. And if they were actually giving informed consent, it would be a different kind of a thing. But it was so normalized in American medical culture that it basically was just a routine. It was just like, no, let's just go ahead and do the circumcision, right? And then this like drugged up mother's like, well, I guess, I don't know, is that what we do here? Ask the dad.
And the dad, of course, had this process happen to him, 20 or 30 years beforehand. And
so he'll say, well, I don't know anything else, and I'm fine. And one of the most common reasons that parents will give is to say the son should look like his father. I was think that's so strange. It's like, why?
Yeah.
Like, if I had my toe cut off or something, and be like, well, my son has to have his toe cut off or he'll be confused. It's like, he won't be that confused. Just tell him like something was done to you that they don't have to do anymore. And how often are you looking at each other's penises anyway? Like, I don't understand the reasoning. It's like, if I went through a medically unnecessary surgery, the last thing I would want to do is then have my child also go through medically unnecessary surgery. But if I have to confront the fact that something happened to me that maybe shouldn't have, I don't want to have that thought. So I'm going to have to say, well, it's probably a good thing. And then if it's a good thing, well, of course I want my child to have it. So it carries on by its own inertia.
It's ironic to me because, you know, I don't typically talk about my circumcision status, but the reason that I was not circumcised is because my father wasn't, because he was born at home. And the reason was, you know, he should look like his father. And it was
interesting, right? So you were spared by the same.
I was spared by the same logic. Yeah, which is it's like, well, that's good. But I will say that, you know, I grew up in the Midwest, and it's like, right, I was the only one in the school.
Yeah, the Midwest, the rates are the highest. It's like, you know, 90% or something in the Midwest. On the coast, it's different. Like on the West Coast where I was born, rates are lower, like 50% out of the hospital, maybe even less than that. So I grew up with a mix of, some boys were circumcised, some weren't, but it was sort of like you encountered both things. But in the Midwest, it's like, it's pretty ubiquitous.
Oh yeah, and it's like, you know, you get if that becomes found out, there, you know, heckling, and you know, kids are going to be made fun of for everything for whatever reason, right? This one just you know, gets highlighted, which is why I start caring about it in 7th grade, because all of a sudden, you know, this is, you know, and so it was a fascinating to me. One of the great things about discovering the internet was like, I'm not weird. There are other people that are worried about this, that are deeply concerned.
Well, also globally, you're in the most common position. Right. It's like a third of men are circumcised globally, and most men in the Western world are not circumcised. It's like United States people in the Midwest that are circumcised. So once you zoom your lens out a little bit and you look at, you know, you have more people who share your status than who don't.